So thank you, Walter Shaub, for coming on to Objections. You're, of course, a former ethics czar for former President Barack Obama and have worked in government ethics, currently work for the Project on Government Oversight.
That's right.
And thank you for coming on to the show.
Sure. Happy to be here, Adam.
So one of the reasons why I asked you to come on, you've been quite vocal about the case of Hunter Biden and his decision to go into the art world, and specifically the White House's arrangements in terms of who is buying his paintings that are currently being estimated for up to $500,000 a piece. Want to kind of start off broadly on your thoughts of the arrangement that you have been quite vocal about.
Yeah, so I think what's really important and people sometimes lose is a sense of the context in which this is unfolding. We've just come through 4 years of the most unethical administration in government in the history of our government. And we really faced some serious threats, both on the front of corruption and the authoritarian aspirations of the former president. When he was running, President Biden really emphasized that point. He ran on an anti-corruption platform. And when you read his platform online, it speaks of sweeping changes that he wanted to bring about. When you read it a little closer, everything he talked about, for the most part, had to do with legislation that needed to be passed. Because, of course, he can make changes during his administration, but they won't outlast his administration unless he makes them. He also talked about the need for the public to be able to trust government and believe that it was being run by people who are always putting the public's interests first and not trying to capitalize on public service, because of course the last administration did that. So that's the context in which this is unfolding. And the current administration has come in and it has built a fairly solid compliance program. It's really focused on following the rules, and they brought in a lot of people with a lot of executive branch experience. So they come in thinking that the way things were working before were good enough. The problem is the Trump administration taught us the systems were always too weak, and we were kidding ourselves thinking we had any kind of government ethics program that could withstand a president who didn't care about government ethics. And the very problem with their administration is they're viewing ethics as a compliance program. Well, when you're complying with rules that are too weak, you don't get a medal for complying. You really need to build an ethical culture. And, again, I give them credit for compliance. The last administration didn't even care about compliance. They were openly hostile to the weak rules that existed. But this new administration has come in and it has complied with the rules and done what Washington always does, capitalize on the loopholes in those rules. And so suddenly you have 4 members of the Ricchetti family working in government, with Biden's top advisor being Steve Ricchetti, and 3 of his children suddenly landing positions in the government, and his brother Jeff Ricchetti lobbying the White House with a firm that Steve Ricchetti co-founded. And when pressed on this, they emphasize that they're complying with the rules. So again, we're back to compliance rather than ethics. And now the president's son is clearly trying to capitalize on the presidency. And that rings of Trumpian ethics. Now, let's be clear. People accuse me of equating the two or drawing a false equivalency. There's no equivalency here. The Trump administration was far, far worse. But we need to rebuild something. We need to rebuild it. And as President Biden puts it, build back better. We need a better ethics program than we used to have. Because if we go back to what we had when we got Trump, then we're going back to the exact conditions that got us Trump and leaving us open to the next president exploiting that. And worse, this hands an excuse to the next president to behave badly and sort of retroactively lays a blessing upon some of the things that Trump did. because there is simply no way an artist who has never even juried into a community center art fair is going to suddenly show up in Washington selling, or show up in New York selling art for $500,000 a pop. And let's talk about the magnitude of this. Is it something like 13 pieces he's selling? So if he sold all 13 for $500,000, that's $6.5 million going to the president's son for being the president's son, not for being an artist. And I just think that's absolutely appalling. Now that's a criticism of Hunter Biden. And he's a sympathetic character who we can feel bad for on many levels, but some of his problems are of his own making, in that he has always built his career around being Joe Biden's son. And here he is doing that once again. If he were a patriot, if he cared about this country, he would not want to tarnish his father's reputation that way. Now, we can't fault him for not being a patriot. We can't fault him for not caring enough about his father's legacy to avoid this. That's a personal failing, and he doesn't technically owe us anything because he's a citizen and not a government official. But then the White House crossed a line, and they got involved in this deal. And the art seller was theoretically always planning to keep the name secret. But the White House intervened to ask him to keep the name secret. Well, all that did was ensure that the public will never know, because Hunter Biden's going to be showing up at the art showings where the prospective buyers are going to be there behind closed doors. And the buyers have no deal. They didn't make a deal with the White House. They haven't promised confidentiality. They would be well within their rights to buy this art. And who pays $500,000 for art without, for art from the president's son, without announcing, I bought art from the president's son and it's hanging on my wall? And the problem is that the White House, by getting involved in allegedly, because they claim they negotiated an agreement, working out an arrangement, now they've inserted the White House, and suddenly it's the public's problem. And what they did is they made sure that we would never find out, but they never promised us that if they do happen to find out, if suddenly somebody shows up at the White House and says, I want a meeting with so-and-so, by the way, I bought Hunter Biden's art, they're not promising to tell us. And I've been pushing them directly. Look, Jen Psaki follows me on Twitter, and I've been tweeting at her, you need to promise us that if you find out. I've also had other conversations with people I can't talk about, but believe me, they are aware of my views, and they have no interest in telling us that if they find out who it is, they're going to notify us anytime that person gets a meeting. And I filibustered long enough here, so I'll just add one last thing, and then I promise to stop. And it's just
I was just about
that,
to say, you anticipated one of my next questions, because when you mentioned that you spoke to Jen Psaki, that she follows you on
well,
Twitter,
I didn't speak to Jen
that you
Psaki.
posted to Jen Psaki.
I have talked to some people, just not Jen Psaki.
Just not Jen Psaki. I was about to mention, of course, as a former Obama ethics czar, there are probably folks who you can reach out to within the Biden administration. I know you said you can't go into those conversations, but can you describe the general tenor of those conversations? What have the reactions been?
Well, I promised whoever I spoke to, and I'm not saying who they are or where they work, that they'd be off the record. But what I can say is that the views I've made very publicly clear, I've made clear through other channels. And the reaction should be obvious from the fact that nothing has changed. And they still haven't released whatever this agreement is. They haven't added to the agreement promising that they're going to tell us if they learn or if somebody gets a meeting.
What would a good ethical agreement and rules look like?
So I think if we really want to step back and go back to before this started, the very first thing that should have happened is the president should have called up his son and said, son, please don't do this. It's going to hurt me. It's going to hurt my legacy. And I have to believe that if he had done that, it would have worked. So I also have to believe that the president is responsible for this going forward. Now, I know people who are watching or listening to this are screaming right now, he's a grown man. But the same people who scream that he's a grown man also screamed that we should treat him like a child, the child of the president, and cut him some deference. I mean, this is a 51-year-old man. He's a year older than I am. And if my dad called and said, you know, you're profiting off my job, and if you go forward, it's going to hurt my job, I would immediately stop. Look, the president had some leverage. You could say, you want to sit at the Thanksgiving table this year? You want to come to the White House Christmas party? Don't do this. But he didn't do that. Or at least it doesn't appear he's done that, because it's hard to believe he wouldn't have succeeded. But let's go forward and say, okay, let's pretend he tried, or let's assume he failed, and say, what now? Well, first of all, the White House shouldn't have been involved. And when the White House got involved talking to the dealer, one White House person said to the Washington Post, in response to a question, why couldn't you push for transparency? The person said that would, quote, restrict interest in the purchase of these pieces of art. Well, restrict interest is a cute way of saying make it harder for Hunter Biden to profit off the presidency, because fewer people would be interested in buying if they knew that the world would know who they were. That there was where the White House really crossed a line, because at that moment, with that comment, they put a blessing on the idea of capitalizing on the presidency. And that is not the culture I think they want to create. And I know some of these people. I know they don't want to create the kind of culture where profiting off the presidency is okay. Their hearts are in the right place. They're just either blinded, or they perhaps have a boss who's being unreasonable and they can't talk him out of it because maybe he's got a blind spot for his kid, which again is understandable, but he needs to overcome that. So they shouldn't have gotten involved. What they should have done instead is say, we're not involved in this, but if we learn that anyone bought this art, we're going to let you know if they get a meeting with any political appointee of this administration. But then we'll go forward in time now. And they didn't do that. They negotiated this deal with the dealer. There were still things they could have done. They could have said, we're going to release the terms of the deal so that you understand exactly what the dealer has committed to. Well, they didn't do that. So let's go forward in time past the point where they made the decision not to release those details to us. They could still today announce that we just want you to understand that if we learn of anybody who purchased this art, we pledge to you that we're going to let you know if they get a meeting with the White House. Now, that is completely within their control, and it doesn't ask anything of Hunter Biden. It lets Hunter Biden go and make $6.5 million profiting off the presidency. He shouldn't, but, you know, assuming they're not able to control him, he can go do that. And yet they're not doing the one thing that's within their control. Instead, they've asked America to outsource government ethics to an art dealer. And art at that high end is notorious for money laundering.
So I was going to, you again anticipated my follow-up question. To people who are wondering, what's the big deal? He goes into the art world, he sells art for extraordinarily high prices for a first-time seller. What is it specifically about the art world that makes this situation problematic?
Yeah, so first of all, the art world is notorious for money laundering, as is real estate, as is banking in countries that have banking secrecy laws. And in June, President Biden announced a new initiative to create an interagency program for really toughening anti-corruption laws by focusing on money laundering and the movement of money across borders. And one of the tasks this group is going to have to do is identify the areas to focus on. Can you imagine a career staffer who's just been through the nightmare of the Trump administration being appointed to serve on this, and they're all sitting around and the elephant is sitting in the room of Hunter Biden's art sales. And they're creating the list and they say, let's focus on discretionary trusts and let's focus on secret banking and let's focus on real estate. And then somebody pipes up and says, and we should focus on art sales too. And everybody says, you know what, look at the time. We should go take a coffee break. We'll come back in a few minutes. And they don't want to include that. I mean, that's the kind of pressure this creates.
Right. And
by the way, I just want to add, the administration forgot to include the Office of Government Ethics in the memo creating this commission, even though it also focused on US government ethics. And I threw a fit and again, talked to some people, and I am told that OGE has now been invited. So at least I think they recognized that mistake and fixed it.
Well, so that illustrates that reform is possible even at this late stage. So in terms of, you mentioned the threat of money laundering. This isn't the first time there's been some controversy involving Hunter Biden's choices of careers. He, of course, sat on the board of Burisma, and there was a lot of criticism about the fact that another member of that board was, actually the head of the company, was a Ukrainian oligarch who was being investigated for money laundering.
Yeah.
Is it, for folks who are willing to excuse this pattern of conduct for political reasons, what's your response to this history that this isn't the first time that Hunter Biden has put the president in a, or back then the former senator, in a difficult situation?
Yeah, I think the history has two prongs to it, and one of them has nothing to do with Hunter Biden himself. One of them has to do with the partisan smear campaign against him. And I think people's reaction to that is part of what makes them go white hot when they hear any criticism of Hunter Biden. They just immediately assume anything is part of that. Well, let's be clear. Most of those allegations against him were not only frivolous, they were malevolent. They were ridiculous and intentional. They were supported in some aspects by actors affiliated with the Russian government. I mean, it's absolutely unfair and ridiculous what happened to him in many respects. There was no interference with the prosecutor. This silly stuff about his laptop is the stuff of Pizzagate rumors. I mean, it's just utter lunacy. At the same time, the other prong of his history is that he's not an angel. This is a guy who, and I'm not talking about his personal problems, I'm talking about his career choices. This is a guy who has clearly endeavored to make money off of his dad being a politician rather than carving out his own path. And the only thing you have to do to understand that is go find the New Yorker article written by Adam Klasfeld, who was very sympathetic of him in many ways, but also honestly reported things like him just accepting a gigantic diamond from a foreign businessman who had interests before the United States government and not having any understanding of why that might be a little sketchy. Or come on, he was on the board of Burisma for a very specific reason. And it's not the reason the conspiracy theorists accuse him of. Nobody was, I think, realistically trying to gain influence with the US government. They were trying to burnish the image of Burisma, which had corruption tainting it for a while, and they needed to clean their act up. So they brought in a former president of another country, they brought in other high-profile figures, and they brought in the son of a US president, and they thought this would make them look better. And as a result, Hunter Biden got a windfall that anybody responsible and ethical and frankly patriotic would have declined. But this is a guy who likes money, and he takes money where he can get it, and he doesn't care. As long as it's not illegal, he doesn't care if it's unsavory. And this is unsavory. And that history, again, shouldn't be attributed to his father, except to the extent that the White House has gotten involved. And the White House has gotten involved in this deal and has refused to do the one thing that it needs to do that it could do, which is, again, promise to tell us if any known buyer gets a meeting with the White House or any other political appointee.
Yeah. And I think that your point about being the target of that he is the target of so many conspiracy theories, a lightning rod for smear campaigns, some of it weaponized by foreign governments, is entirely on point in terms of, but also, as you noted, the broader picture of him burnishing the reputation of a Russian oligarch by sitting on the, excuse me, and a Ukrainian oligarch by sitting
Right.
on a board, elevating his surname.
A Ukrainian oligarch, by the way, who had to flee the country for a while to avoid prosecution. So.
Absolutely. So, in terms of, given the background that folks are on guard for the disinformation there, he has been the subject of articles that seek to smear him for having, in one instance, heart-to-heart conversations with his father about his drug abuse. Given that background, how can you convince people who do not want to hear it, wait a minute, this is real, this is a problem, and most importantly, this is a problem that can be solved if enough pressure and attention is dedicated to it?
Yeah, I think there will always be some people who can't be reached because they're just hopeless partisans and feel that everyone on their side should always get a free pass no matter what, because somehow promoting government ethics and holding people accountable um, advantages the other side. And you're not going to reach them. I have learned the hard way that sometimes um, you put off people who might be unreachable by using emotional language to describe this outrage. And like everyone else, I'm traumatized by the last 4 years that we've just come through. And so I tend to react very strongly to the disappointment of an administration that just thinks going back to the way Washington always did things is good enough. And maybe sometimes I've come off strong in a way that has put off the people who can be reached. But the reality is, this really is a stain on an administration's efforts to restore confidence in the US government. Foreign countries are looking to us right now to see if we can be relied on. And we're behaving like countries that the US would criticize. If, for instance, some foreign country in a developing nation had just turned over leadership to a new president who ran on an anti-corruption platform, and they came in and said, "Yeah, we're gonna bring back ethics," and then immediately it's announced that the president's son of that country, let's call it Parador, like the Richard Dreyfuss movie, Moon Over Parador. If suddenly the new president of Parador's son is selling art for $6 million after having never been in even a community center art show, the US State Department would be showing up at the presidential palace asking them to knock it off. And we don't hold ourselves to that same standard. I think people are also blinded by the fact that they feel they can trust this administration. And to some extent, this administration deserves more trust than the last one because they do care at least about compliance. So their attitude is, well, we're not going to let people curry favor and have special meetings just because the son of the president sold them art for inflated prices that they paid only because he's the son of the president. And they may be right, but you can't run an ethics program like that because presidents are setting precedent. And I think we can all agree that somebody who bought $6 million worth of art from Don Jr. would have gotten favorable treatment from Donald Trump. And they might get it from the next president. And the next president, by the way, could be Donald Trump, or it could be someone like him. And they could point to this example and say, you were fine with it when Joe Biden's son did it. You're hypocrites for not doing it, for complaining now. And I think that if we're trying to raise the bar, we have to raise it by behaving better. And I think some of the counter arguments are frankly hysterical. I mean, people just are hysterical saying, oh, Hunter Biden can't do anything for a living. Shaub thinks that he has to be unemployed. He's going to live on a steam grate and that'll be the only thing acceptable. Well, first of all, the man's a multimillionaire, so he's not going to live on a steam grate. And second of all, he could sell art all he wants at a community center for, $500 a piece instead of 500,000 a piece. Or he can be a lawyer. And you know what? I think we do have to cut some people a little room to make a living. And so I think maybe there would be people who would unfairly criticize him and say, well, he's only in this law job or only has these clients or is only this hedge fund manager because he's the president's son. Well, I think in that case, he would be performing work in his chosen profession that he's got a track record of doing. And it would be easy to say, well, maybe his business has increased a little, but not a lot. And so that's fine. Saying he can't sell art for $500,000 a pop is not saying he has to live on a steam grate and never hold a job.
Right.
So.
And so going back to your point from the beginning of the show and about replacing a culture of compliance with ethics and from commitments to rules and laws, what would those rules and regulations look like that would ensure that the current president's children and future president's children must comply, that there is something with real teeth?
Yeah. So I think we have to step back there too and realize a lot of what we depended on were norms, and they fell apart when you had somebody who just bucked norms. And so people are tired of norms and say we should throw out the norms and only have laws. Well, they're only partly right, because President Trump also ignored laws and even the Constitution. And when the Justice Department is the one that has to enforce those laws, they're not going to enforce them against the president. They've made that clear. In fact, even the Constitution was violated by President Trump when he took foreign emoluments and even domestic emoluments. And all the laws on the book don't help you if you have no one to enforce them or a Congress that can't conduct meaningful oversight. So we need a combination of laws and norms. We can't just say norms are gone. What norms do is they raise the expectation of the American public. They remind us what we're entitled to expect from our leaders, to demand of them. And for those who say norms fell, they are ignoring the fact that Donald Trump lost the election because people were so outraged by the corruption. Now, they were also outraged by the incompetence and the danger he brought about during this pandemic. And so some would argue that's the only reason he lost. I think if people were not so fed up with the corruption, even the pandemic might not have been enough to push an incumbent president out of the White House. So norms did play a role. And that's why it's very dangerous when a new administration comes in and doesn't understand that tone from the top matters and that compliance isn't enough. You need to set expectations higher with very strong norms and not only reinstitute the existing norms from before Trump, but set the bar higher so that the public is even more attuned to the difference. Well, frankly, to a developing nation studying the US and seeing if it should adopt our ethics program or some other country's ethics program, a country in which the president's son is running around with White House involvement, selling art for $6.5 million if he gets the price he's asking for, is not going to be able to distinguish this significantly from what they see the past administration doing. Sure,
Okay.
it's a difference in magnitude, but it's not a difference in nature. It's a huge difference in magnitude, but not a difference in nature. And that matters as we go forward and try to pressure future leaders and create a civic population that's committed to holding leaders accountable. Then you also need laws, and you need laws with teeth. But you have to remember that they're not going to be enforced by the Department of Justice. So one of the biggest reforms we need is laws that make it easier for Congress to enforce subpoenas, for instance. They spent 2 years fighting to get Don McGahn, President Trump's former White House counsel, to testify in a congressional hearing. And even after Trump was out of office and the White House was now occupied by Joe Biden, Biden's Justice Department forced House Democrats to settle for a behind closed door deposition. And that set a very dangerous precedent that Congress is just not going to waste its time seeking subpoenas until they get a new law with some kind of expedited procedure in court, because it's not going to lead to a public hearing. And the whole point of the public hearing with Don McGahn was that we had a country full of people who didn't read the 400-page Mueller report. So putting Don McGahn in front of a camera would highlight some of the worst abuses that Mueller uncovered, so that the public would then actually receive that information. Forcing them to do it behind closed doors destroyed that effort. And people may wonder, well, why did a White House fight a House of Representatives led by the exact same party? And I think people are naive sometimes, particularly on social media, thinking everything is a left and right battle. This was a battle between the legislative branch and the executive branch. And the executive branch won, as it seems to always win these times. And that happened because President Biden came in, filled the White House with experienced executive branch people who have executive branch sensibilities, and have continued the long, decades-long steady march toward executive branch power aggrandizement at the expense of checks and balances. And this, too, is where, if President Biden was more focused on ethics in the broader sense and the idea of government accountability, he would have surrendered some executive branch power by saying, yes, we are no longer going to oppose the House forcing Don McGahn to testify in front of a hearing. But again, this is not the administration that understands what's at stake. All the power that they are grabbing, and Trump grabbed, and the Obama administration, and the Bush, and the Clinton, and the first Bush, and the Reagan, and all the ones before that, for nearly a century, have built a stronger and stronger and stronger executive branch that was just primed and ready for Trump to abuse. And the next person with his sensibilities in the White House is going to have even more powers to abuse, because this White House is doing what all past White Houses in modern times have done, grabbing more power to hand over to that future president. So I think there's a real failure to understand the threat that Trump posed and the ongoing threat that authoritarianism poses in our country. And so when people think I'm blowing the Hunter Biden thing out of proportion, what they're missing is that this is all part of a larger concern. And it isn't really about Hunter Biden. It's about the failure to understand that we need an ethical renaissance in government, or we're going to find ourselves in an even worse place than we did for the last 4 years. And the last thing I'll say on that is the key piece of evidence of this is that President Biden expended so much political capital on infrastructure and not on voting rights. And right now, Jim Crow laws are sweeping the states, and they are literally stealing democracy from vulnerable populations, and even reassigning the counting or control of counting those votes to partisan legislatures. So we are in a red alarm fire, and we have a White House that is probably more competent than any White House we've ever had. These are skilled, smart, highly experienced people. But the double-edged sword of that is that these are people who carry with them the baggage of executive branch loyalty and a sensibility that government ethics rules are these inconvenient things that get in the way. And Trump was just an anomaly. And as long as we don't have Trump, we don't really need rules. And it's just an absolute lack of foresight, a failure to appreciate the danger our country faces right now. And I find myself quite often very scared that we're going to pay the price for this. And I really hope I'm wrong. But I spend a lot of time worrying about this.
Well, I think that cautionary warning is a great note to end on. Thank you very much, Walter, for joining us.
Thanks, Adam.